And good afternoon and welcome. My name is Ryan Belmore. I am the owner and publisher of What's Up Newp, and we are here. Our author series is back after a little bit of a short break, but it is back. And just a reminder that our author series is brought to you by Charter Books, which is opened at 8 Broadway here in Newport. It is open. It is beautiful inside. I invite you all to stop by the store today. You can shop them online anytime at charterbookstore.com. You can also pop in. They're open 7 days a week, and Steve and his crew down there are doing great things. And the lead for our author series is Mr. Frank Prosnitz. And Frank, how are you?
I'm doing fine. Just a quick shout out about Charter Books and local bookstores. It doesn't get better than that, and it's great if we can support them. An unbelievable resource in our community. So urge people to go in and take a look, see what you find, meet the people in there. Be a fun time.
And speaking of local, it doesn't get much more local than the book we're going to speak about today.
It's Peter Lance is the author. The book is Homicide at Rough Point, something that people tried to hide for a long time. It reads like a fiction novel. Maybe Grisham could have written it, but it was Peter Lance who wrote it. Uncovered what is perhaps maybe the crime of the centuries in Newport. Good morning, Peter.
Hey, great to be with you, gentlemen.
Good to have you here. Peter, maybe you can just start a little bit and just take us real briefly through the premise of this book. What was it that motivated you to undertake this? And then, of course, we want to talk about what the response has been. And we want to make sure, and obviously we'll pursue questions. We want to know what happened. We want to know the cover-up. And that
say who, what, when, where, why, and how. The 5-point lead.
So my years of journalism may have put it there. Right?
There you go.
The why may come first, but go ahead.
All right,
give us an overview.
Yeah. All right. Well, it all relates to the fact that my first job as a cub reporter. I've been a lifelong journalist and author with the mid-career. I was a screenwriter in LA on episodic TV, but then became a book writer after 9/11. So, my whole career has been essentially as a reporter and working writer. And I started at the Newport Daily News for $50 a week in 1967, working for the Sherman family and learning how to read upside down when the police didn't want to show us the reports, how to write a 5-point lead. And my first year was actually 6 months. I went to Northeastern undergrad. When I started, the town was abuzz with this story that Doris Duke had, quote, gotten away with murder. 8 months prior, on October 7th, 1966, when she was leaving her estate at the end of Bellevue, Rough Point, with Eduardo Torella, her longtime 7-year-long designer, companion, curator of most of the art in Rough Point. During that period, they were leaving her estate. He was driving. He got out to open the gate. Suddenly, she got behind the wheel. The car lurched forward, and eventually, she crushed him to death across the car. Eventually, the wagon, the 2-ton Dodge Polara, ended up across Bellevue Avenue, crashed against a tree, knocked down 20 feet of post and rail fence. He was dead. And within 96 hours, the police chief, Joseph A. Radisey, who was a veteran of Newport, 41 years at that point, closed the case, called it an unfortunate accident. He then quickly walked that back when the attorney general said, "Oh, you're rushing to judgment." But then the next day, they claimed to have done a 3-page interrogation of Doris, and that closed the case. Shortly thereafter, she began giving money to Newport, massive amounts of money. Ultimately, the Newport Restoration Foundation was the greatest beneficiary to the city of Doris's philanthropy. And she had never given $1 to Newport prior to then. And the rumors persisted. So anyway, cut to 50 years later, I had all this experience, which I didn't have at the time. Clearly, I couldn't have done this story then. I decided to just see if I could put the pieces together. I had worked in 2010. I did 3 books on counterterrorism for HarperCollins. And my third book, Triple Cross, I worked with a New York NYPD detective, homicide detective named James Moss, And with an Egyptian former undercover operative for the FBI, we actually solved a 19-year-old violent homicide of an imam in Brooklyn. So having done that, I thought, well, maybe I could, put this together. And Detective Moss, now retired, helped me out initially. And what I did was I went on Facebook. There's a group called if you grew up in Newport, Rhode Island, share some memories, 10,500 members at the time. And every 3 months or so, they would post a shot of the crash, and people would go, I knew that guy, or isn't that the cop that was there, and et cetera, et cetera. And there were all kinds of wild rumors. So I started with that group. That's what I did. I mined essentially that group. And it was tremendous outpouring from Newporters, people who were actually there after the fact, ex-police officer, retired police officers who were there. And the one police officer who really put it together for me was Edward Angel, who was the first officer on the scene. So that's a long version of how did this start, but it's a good overview.
So maybe go back a little bit and talk about Doris Duke, who she was, how she was perceived in the community before all of this happened, and whether there were indications by her behavior that this was something that was certainly within the scope of reality.
Okay, well, Doris Duke was, at the time, 1966, she was the richest woman in America and the third richest in the world, behind Queen Juliana of the Netherlands and Queen Elizabeth. She had been left $55 million when she was 12 or so, when her father died. They called her then the richest girl in the world. And her father, on his deathbed, James Buchanan Duke, made 3 fortunes. One with American tobacco. He created the modern cigarette as we know it. Lucky Strike was the first big brand. And then Alcoa Aluminum, and then Duke Power, which is now Duke Energy. So fabulously wealthy, wealth beyond wealth. But he was very paranoid, and he said to her at his deathbed, trust no one. And as a result, Doris herself was very paranoid. She was educated at home, and she had 5 estates eventually. She had a Rough Point in Newport, Rhode Island, Duke Farms, 2,500-acre estate in New Jersey. She had bought Falcon Lair, the old Rudolph Valentino estate in Bel Air, LA. She had this incredible Islamic-themed estate in Diamond Head, Hawaii called Shangri-La. And she also had a lavish Park Avenue apartment, so not an estate, but 5 residences. And she was notoriously stingy, notoriously bad to her health. She was an incredible litigator. She was involved in over 40 litigations in her life, and she even sued her own mother over the initial inheritance. And she often would stiff, creditors and then say, sue me. So she was a very mean-spirited person and jealous. She was a Scorpio, born November 22nd. 1912, and to that end, as to what there might have been within her worldview that might have suggested she was capable of committing murder later on, her common-law husband was a guy named Joseph Armand Castro. She was with him for over a decade. He was a brilliant young Mexican-American jazz musician and band leader, and she loved jazz, as you know. She later became a patron of the jazz festival. And anyway, at one point in 1964, now this is 2 years before the incident with Eduardo, where he was killed, she was playing piano. I believe it was either in Hawaii or at Falcon Lair, and Joe made some kind of a crack about her piano playing. She rushed into the kitchen, got a butcher knife, and slashed his arm, and causing 150 stitches. And he later alleged that it really affected his ability to earn a living or play a piano for the rest of his life. So that was completely covered up. And to give you an idea of the kind of strong arm tactics that her lawyers used, he was literally shanghaied in Hawaii. He was grabbed off the streets, taken to Falcon Lair, and basically sweated for a couple of days incommunicado by her lawyers in Hawaii after he had sued her in LA. He sued her for assault. He sued her to confirm the common law marriage, and he sued her for alimony. And they basically, even though the canon of ethics says lawyers cannot talk to people who are represented by counsel, they violated that. But more importantly, they basically convinced him, she's going to write you into her will. She'll set up a record company for you. Come home, Joe. She loves you, etc. And he went along with it. And he dropped it. And he betrayed his LA lawyer, by the way. And then basically he stayed with her for about another, I don't know, year or so. And then there's an incredible incident in the book that was recounted by Stephanie Mansfield, who I cite in the book several times, who wrote the best Duke biography called The Richest Girl in the World, where one night Doris summoned this record company executive, Peter Brook, from the company she'd set up. And she said, "Get over here." This is in LA, to Falcon Lair. And so he rushes over, not knowing what he's going to find. He comes into the kitchen. Joe, according to this account from Peter Brook to Stephanie Mansfield, he's standing in the window. There's like a French window overlooking the garden, naked from the waist down, urinating into the garden and drunk out of his mind, according to this gentleman. And then Brook goes into the bedroom where he finds Doris with a broken jaw. This is all, it's an incredibly dramatic scene. And then basically she says, "Get him out of here." He got Joe out by giving him a very valuable bottle of champagne. They get to the Bel Air Hotel. Joe throws it on the ground, and that was it. And shortly thereafter, he married a very young, beautiful singer, Loretta Haddad, which was part of what triggered Doris's jealousy. So if you're willing to stab your common law husband with a butcher knife, and by the way, the aftermath of that is documented in some of the 1,000 pages of documents I got from the Rubenstein Library at Duke University. Doris's papers document. If you're willing to do that, then it's conceivable you might consider that you might get away with murder.
Interestingly, Peter, last night I was talking to a friend, and he knew an individual who had been a butler at Rough Point, and Doris had been planning a major event. And his mother died, and he approached Doris and said, I can't be at the event. And Doris apparently told him that if he wasn't there, he would lose his job and don't come back. He went to the funeral, came back, found all of his belongings out in the driveway in front of the mansion, and that was an example of who she was.
Well, there was another really interesting example, perfectly in line with that, Frank, wherein a gentleman contacted me. I wrote a piece in Vanity Fair last summer in the combined July-August issue. My first iteration of this telling of the story was in an 8,000-word piece in Vanity Fair. And after that, a gentleman contacted me who was 90 years old, but he sounded like he was 60 on the phone. He was incredibly fit. Worked in the RAF, an Irishman who joined the RAF during World War II, was a gunner in the Pacific on PBYs, a very sharp guy, and he had been a big game hunter at the time, back in 1967. And essentially what happened was he would take off 5 months a year during the monsoon season, from June till October. So 8 months after this happened, he was in Hawaii, Doris was in Hawaii, and I checked out all of this. I checked out where they were, what hotel. So the first night at a series of parties, they went home together, and they were inseparable for the next 5 months. And at one point, he said they were in Shangri-La, and somebody had done some damage to like one of the pillars, ironically, of her estate. There was a statue or something on it, and then a car hit it, or something happened. Maybe there was a delivery truck. I don't remember the details. So she lined up the entire staff of about 12 and said to them, "I want to know who did this." Now, they either didn't know or they were trying to protect the person that did. And she said, "Listen, if I don't, I'm going to go down, count to 3, and I'm going to go write down 3 of you. You're going to be gone if you don't tell me." And the first one, shook her head. Second one, these are people that had worked for her for years, by the way, that were loyal. And she fired 3 of them like that on the spot. And then, of course, none of the other ones, they all took the same position, and she couldn't fire the rest of the staff. But that was how vindictive she was. As to her cheapness, this is a really interesting thing that stuck out. There's a guy, David Rimmer, who was her estate manager in New Jersey and all of her estates, wonderful man who really loved Eduardo. When he found out that Eduardo was killed, he had just come back from Falcon Lair, but he was in New Jersey, so he got a quick plane, the last flight to Boston, and then she had a deal with the Newport Air Park, or the Aero Commanders, to come down to Newport. He gets to Newport and he's told, "Do not come, go back home. We don't need you." They didn't want him there because they knew they were working on their cover up, and they knew that he would object to what they were doing. So he had to go back the next day. But he told me that Doris actually, through her business manager, Pete Cooley, demanded that Torello's family repay the second half of his unused air ticket after she crushed him to death. Okay. Sorry.
Take us through the actual accident. Torello he had been planning on leaving Rough Point, correct?
Yeah. So what happened with Eduardo was can I give you a quick overview of him that will help really better answer that question?
Sure.
He was a Renaissance man. He came from a family of 5 sisters and 3 brothers, a very middle-class Italian family in Dover, New Jersey. And he had stars in his eyes from when he was young. In fact, one person that knew him back then that I interviewed said that he would drive by Duke Farms and he'd say, someday I'm going to go inside those walls and do something great. And he actually created this incredible series of greenhouses, from abandoned greenhouses, a botanical display that was considered the best in America, glass house display. Doris, of course, took all the credit, but it was his design, execution, etc. Well, anyway, during the war, he was like a singer, and he knew Sinatra in New Jersey. They performed at some of the places where big bands were. And then when the war broke out, and Frank Sinatra, basically spent the war working with Capitol Records on this side of the puddle, Eduardo enlisted, and he was only 5'10", but he carried a 30 caliber machine gun through the Ardennes forest in the Battle of the Bulge, and he won the Bronze Star. And he got 2 Purple Hearts because he almost lost the toes on each foot from frostbite. So when he got back, he was in a hospital for a few months, came home, never told his family that he won the Bronze Star. The first time they knew it was when they got a grave marker from the Pentagon after his death, and it said BSM for Bronze Star. So that's an indicator of what a humble guy he was. Loved everybody, treated everybody beautifully, constantly stuck up for the help in all of Doris's houses. But let's cut back to his career. So then he was gay, he happened to be gay, and he was in New York, and he worked at Saks Fifth Avenue as a hat designer. But prior to that, he designed costumes for Mae West in a Broadway production of Diamond Lil, which was one of her films. And then he was in the chorus of it, and they went on the road with her. He did that for a while. That combined his design talents with his, song and dance skills. And then he became the head of the millinery department at Saks, where he met his kind of lifelong partner after that, Edmund Cara. And Edmund Cara designed costumes for Lena Horne. So the two of them ultimately went to LA. They had a house in Laurel Canyon, and eventually they moved up to Big Sur, where Edmund was a full-time sculptor, and Eduardo would commute between LA and Big Sur. And he got into the film business. One of his closest friends was Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate was discovered by a producer named Marty Ransohoff, who saw the talent Eduardo had as a set designer, hired him to do a film with David Niven. Then he did this famous film, The Sandpiper, with Taylor and Burton. And all of this is in my book. Everything I'm telling you is recounted in much more detail in the book. In 1964, there was the second film they did after Cleopatra, Taylor and Burton. He was a close friend of Kim Novak's, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, he and Edmund both got credits on that film. And then he did another film with Sharon Tate, kind of a Malibu beach blanket bingo thing. So ironically, Sharon Tate, and I opened the book with a scene involving Sharon Tate in the introduction of the book, who met Doris Duke in 1969. She months before her own death. It's a kind of an eerie scene and an interesting way, I think, to open the book. But so anyway, Eduardo his career was amping up. He made $43,000 the last year of his life. Now, multiply that by a factor of 8. So that's like current $350,000 in current dollars, about, okay? And so he had tremendous earning capacity. He was only 42 years old. He had at least 20 more years to live. And so Doris refused to settle with his 5 sisters and 3 brothers, steadfastly refused. This is all documented in letters that I got out of the Rubenstein Library at Duke. They even said, would you give us $200,000? She flatly refused. Now, this was at a time she was making $1 million a week in interest on her fortune. Imagine that. She didn't have to, she could stand in the corner of her room for a week and she'd be $1 million richer. So she still turned them down and forced the family to sue for wrongful death, which they did in Providence, $2.5 million. But she dragged that out, Frank, for 5 years, and ultimately decided to go to trial, and her lawyer was this character named Aram Arabian, who was kind of the Roy Cohn of New England back then, known as very unscrupulous, but a real tough litigator. And he basically, during the trial, Doris in the what they call the penalty phase. I have a law degree. Don't hold it against me. In the penalty phase of trial, she was found civilly liable, as was like OJ in his civil case. But when they got to the damage phase of trial, Aram Arabian played. I mean, he so denigrated Eduardo. Now imagine, this is an urban jury in Providence in 1966. And any gay man back then, prior to the gay rights movement, was considered half a man. That's not me talking. That's just kind of the reality of what it was. And so he so diminished him, made him look like a sycophant and a ne'er-do-well and a loser, that the damage award was, get ready for this, $75,000. And by the time the lawyers took their cut, his 5 sisters and 3 brothers each got $5,620. And, after I knew the details of his death, that's what affected me more. That's what kept driving me forward to try and get to the truth of this story. Because
take me back a little bit.
Yeah,
I want to go back to the actual incident itself. So Eduardo was he had been away at the time and planning, when he got back, planning to leave.
Planning to tell her, but all of his friends knew how allegedly unstable she was. The Rubenstein documents document lifelong alcohol and barbiturate abuse, radical mood swings, a history of violence, etc. And so they said, don't go back. He said, I can handle her. So, but he didn't tell her why. He asked her to rent a station wagon because he had paintings in all of her estates, and he wanted to clear out his room at Rough Point. And he said, listen, I'm just going to put my paintings down at my mother's house in New Jersey. This is why he asked her to rent a wagon, which she did from Pelham Garage, which was the Avis dealership, a Dodge Polara 1966 wagon, which has the shift on the wheel, becomes relevant. So, so he flies into to Newport Airport. She picks him up that morning. That's very an important thing, that she drove to pick him up. So she'd driven the car before. She then, later on in the day, she drove the car another time. And where they were going that night, and because she never bought a piece of art without his final imprimatur, that Eduardo had kind of blessed this work of art that I'm going to buy for Rough Point or anywhere else. They were going to buy the reliquary of Saint Ursula, which is a bust of the saint from the 4th century AD. It was carved around 1500, and she was one of the most beloved saints in Europe. And it reportedly has in its chest a relic, which is a kind of a Catholic thing. Catholics in the audience will understand. A little weird, but so, and those relics were highly praised by robber barons at the time. J.P. Morgan had 8 of them because they were seen to have a symbol of control of money and power over the divine. So if you had a reliquary in your mansion, that was kind of a cool thing. So anyway, she bought it a year earlier, had it restored by Ide Bethune, the very famous Newport artisan. And then they were going to pick it up after Eduardo had looked at it. So they went down to this antique shop, the Blue Cat, run by John Perkins Brown on Franklin Street earlier in the day. He said, let me give it some more thought. And then he told her later in the afternoon, yeah, I think it's good. It's great. Let me do some research. He did. And they were going to pick it up. That's where they were going. Now, the rumors that Radice said they were going to dinner, untrue. But they were going out of the estate. And Eduardo was driving, and he got out of the car. Now, Doris later told the police something that was not true. She said, we had done this 100 times before. He would drive up to the gate. He would open the gates. I would slide over, drive the car through. He would close the gates, get in, and we'd go on. Her caretaker, Howard McFarland, told Rhode Island investigators that never happened. Doris never drove a car if there was a chauffeur or someone to drive it for her. But anyway, so what happened was, according to her, and this is the story that Radice put out, he gets out, he walks up to the gate, didn't even have a chance to open the gate. There's these 15-foot gates, 7 feet wide, wrought iron. There was a metal stop holding them in. They swung each way, but they were held in by a metal stop and what's called an escutcheon plate at the top, holding them in. And all of a sudden, she gets behind the wheel. Now, she commits 4 affirmative acts. She gets behind the wheel. She releases the parking brake, which he had engaged. She then put it into gear, and then she gunned the accelerator, hit the accelerator, so that the car left tire with gouge marks in the gravel driveway, almost 2 inches deep, okay? And then, now I'm going to give away what I discovered. This is a little bit spoiler alert, so if people haven't read the book and they don't want to know this, maybe whatever, just go like this. But what happened was that he went up on the hood of the vehicle, which is actually a thing that people do when they're being approached. It's like a lizard brain response. You kind of want to save your life. So he jumped up on the hood. Now, this was the theory of Fred Newton, the Newport Police Department accident investigator, and it was also confirmed by an individual that I had investigate this from one of the top forensic firms in the country that does this kind of automobile death investigation. He did extensive research for me just for free because he was so fascinated by it. He also believed the same thing. So Eduardo is up on the hood, staring at her, no doubt, through the windshield, terrified. And she blows through these gates. She bends the gates, blows them out. They bend. There are baluster rungs at the bottom. 5 of them are knocked out. And she then, and he's still alive, though, at this point. He's still alive. He fractured his hip. That was the only damage to his body at that point. And then she tapped the brakes for a moment, hesitating outside the gates of Rough Point for whatever reason. And then he rolled off onto the street. Obviously, he's alive. He's no doubt calling, Doris, Doris. And then she calculated and decided to commit, at which point she just drove over him, dragged him another 40 feet across Bellevue Avenue, knocked him against the curb, went up on the estate of the Lorillard estate across Quattrell, knocked down 20 feet of post and rail fence, and the wagon, the 2-ton wagon, came to rest parallel to Rough Point against a tree. And he was eviscerated under the rear axle. So much so that when the rescue wagons got there, their jacks were insufficient to get the car up so they could extricate his body. They had to get the tow truck from Pelham Garage to lift it. And Doris was the only living witness. And I can give you more details if you want. I don't want to, because I tend to go on and on until you interrupt me.
That's okay. Did Doris suffer any injuries?
She suffered mild. Bill Watterson, who was a Newport officer, or later a great detective, but I got to him. He met her in Newport Hospital after there were 2 wagons that responded. Middletown Rescue first, because Newport was tied up. So she went to the hospital alive in the Middletown wagon, and then Eduardo's body went in the Newport wagon. And Bill Watterson said she had what I call steering wheel injuries, minor bruises. Now, this is a very important point I need to make. The medical examiner at the time was Dr. Philip McAllister, who ironically, and I only learned this when I did this, was my family doctor growing up. I was really close to his 2 kids. My parents, he was wonderful. He made house calls. He was a great doctor. But he allowed himself to cross the line that night. And even though he was assistant medical examiner in charge of determining the cause of death, he allowed himself to be hired as Doris's private doctor, Frank, whereupon he puts her in a private room at Newport Hospital. And the state investigators from the Registry of Motor Vehicles, as they called it then, Louis A. Parati, still alive, his partner's dead. I interviewed him extensively. They could not get to see her, and they were duty bound to interview any driver in a homicide, all right, a vehicular homicide. And then she came home the next day. They wouldn't let these guys see her at Rough Point. And then finally, they were allowed to stand at the end of a paper-thin interview of her on Sunday at Rough Point, which is important for me to discuss, but ask me more questions if I've left any gaps.
So I wanted to talk about the cover-up, and we're getting into that a little bit. How did that start? What motivated people to go along with Doris, or did you just simply pay people off? And how high up were the individuals who were involved in the cover-up, and what happened to them since? Okay.
So first of all, Doris she'd already succeeded in covering up the Joe Castro stabbing. She made sure they did not go to the hospital that night or report it to the police. So she'd already been through a situation involving a violent crime that she perpetrated, that she was able to dodge and escape. So she had, again, she had a series of minions around her, and I'll do a quick little detour, but I'll get back to answering the question. She notoriously had her minions, and these involved lawyers, private investigators, press flacks, go into and kind of clean up the record of her troubled life. So that, for example, the photograph of the undercarriage of the Dodge Polara crashed against the tree, which was in the Newport Daily News the next night, page one story, on the 10th of October of '66. There's blood. You can see blood beneath the axle. That negative of that photograph was selectively removed from the archives of the Daily News at the Newport Historical Society. It's the first thing I did when I got to Newport in '18 to research every negative before, every negative after that was published in the paper. A week on either side was there except that negative. And I found that negative through John Quigley and his wife, Jane McGuire. He's the stepson of Ed Quigley, the reporter who took it. They happened to have a negative in their basement. It made it when I had the Vanity Fair piece. They published that as the double truck open to the piece, Frank. That's how important that photograph was. Yeah. The entire transcript of the wrongful death case missing from Rhode Island Judicial Archives. I was able to find because they sued Avis in federal court and never went to trial because the car was in perfect working order. I found 173 pages in the National Archives. That's how important the National Archives thought Doris was. And so I was able to get a few more pieces of information from that. But the trial transcript is missing. So she had all these people that would go in after and clean up after her. Now, so you're asking me about the cover-up itself. So here's what happened. So remember I said she came home on Saturday. It happened on Friday night. Came home during the day on Saturdays, protected. Linda McFarland Knierim, who was the daughter of Harold, the caretaker, who wrote a beautiful memoir called The Caretaker's Daughter, growing up at Rough Point. Beautiful book, 130 pages. She devoted 10 to Eduardo. She cared about him so much. And she recounted that night, the horror. She called it that horrible night. Anyway, so she was going to go to a football game, De La Salle, some kind of a game that day at Freebody Park. Her father says, they don't want you to go. They don't want you to leave, Linda, because people might start asking questions. Anyway, so on Sunday in her bedroom, she was interviewed by Frank Walsh. Now, here's the hierarchy. Joseph A. Radice was the chief. Paul Sullivan was the chief of detectives, the heir apparent to take over as chief. And then under him was Lieutenant Frank Walsh. And there was another detective named George Watts. Frank Walsh conducts this paper-thin 4-question, 5-answer interview with her. She's in her bed. She's got one of her vicious German shepherds on either side. And anybody in Newport that lived around there will tell you about her vicious dogs. And basically, the registry guys got to stand, but they couldn't ask any questions. Mr. Parati said to me, Peter, by the time we got there, the fix was in. If you go to peterlance.com, my website, you can see that transcript. You can look at it. And then they closed the case. And now Monday, Radice issues a statement if you had been on the Journal then, you would have gotten it, AP, UPI, New York Times. Unfortunate accident, we're closing the case, and said nothing more. But Alton Schlegel was this really great criminal reporter for the New York Daily News that had come to Newport. And for example, he's the first one to figure out about McAllister's conflict of interest. And McAllister, by the way, the doctor said she was bleeding profusely from the head. Absolutely untrue. Not just confirmed by Bill Watterson, the cop at the hospital, but I also interviewed the first witness on the scene who was just a newly minted ensign, a Navy nurse. And I interviewed her, and she said, no, she had a couple of little scrapes, etc. So Schlegel quoted Attorney General J. Joseph Nugent as saying, no, this is a rush to judgment. So within an hour, to use a contemporary term, Radice walked back. He said, oh, no, it's not closed. The case is not closed. Now, this is the clincher of the whole book. This is, to me, the most important discovery I made was that Radice goes to Aram Arabian, her lawyer, and said, you got to give me something so I can close out this case. And Aram Arabian says to him, I'll tell you what, you write up a transcript of an interview, like as if you interviewed her in real time, question, answer, and if we like it, we'll sign it. Now, when have you ever heard in your life of an objective finder of fact in a murder investigation, homicide investigation doing that? So that's what they did. That is published it's available online at peterlance.com, and it's published in chapter 7 of my book. And here's how we know it's a fraud. We know it's a fraud because the first question they ask is Q, and it's all typed, and it says on it, interrogation by Captain Paul Sullivan, 12:30 p.m., Rough Point, at Newport, etc. And then the first question is, we understand you were born on November 22nd, 1928. They got her date of birth wrong. So Doris, and the answer is yes, in typewriting, okay, in typeface. But she says, she crosses it out and writes 1912 and then initials it DD. Now, if that was an actual transcript of an interview in real time, if they got it wrong, the transcriber would have picked that up, right? So that is what we in the law call prima facie evidence of fraud. But that, once she signed that transcript, that was it. The case was closed. And about 8 days later, she made her first gift to the Newport, the Cliff Walk restoration. Then she gave $10,000 worth 80 today to Newport Hospital, that having protected her, and eventually set up the Restoration Foundation. Radice retired to Florida, and on a $7,000 a year salary, bought the first of 2 condos in a very modern new condominium building. Did I see the receipts? No. But one thing I found that's fascinating about Radice, he married into a mafia-related family. The Cappucciano family were bookies that worked for Raymond Patriarca. And Radice's third wife, Mary Flynn Cappucciano, and her brother Dominic was a bookie. He ran Ann's Kitchen in Middletown. Many people knew Ann's Kitchen for years. He was a bookie. So, I mean, they weren't like, you know, Joe Pesci level mobsters, but still, it was the mafia. It was La Cosa Nostra. And that's Radice's immediate family. In fact, his brother-in-law, Dom, bought a condo on the same floor in that same condominium in Hollywood, Florida.
Peter, quick question about Nugent. Was he in on this, or was he just oblivious to it after his first involvement?
I think Nugent, J. Joseph Nugent, acted in a reprehensible way, and I will tell you, and he has a son who's a judge today in Superior Court. I tried to reach out to several times to discuss his father with him, and he never responded. J. Joseph Nugent, so he basically said, did the right thing initially. We need to investigate further. And he had the power, by the way, as the Attorney General to look over whatever Newport did before the case was disposed. What happened was the police report was missing for decades. The police report was the holy grail of the Ark of the Covenant of my investigation, right? Stephanie Mansfield couldn't get it in 1992 when she did, I went through incredible permutations, and I was aided by the city manager, Joe Nicholson, who did everything he could to get the police chief to scour Gary Silver, the current chief, to scour the department. And they claim they don't have it, it's missing, okay? Well, it's hard to believe that a report like that, and there, by the way, the law of Rhode Island is you have to preserve every record. You can purge some things, right? But you can't purge records of deaths, even accidental deaths, okay? So, but eventually I got the report, and it contained not only the Newport Police Department findings, but the findings of the Registry of Motor Vehicles, Mr. Parati. And, at one point, Mr. Parati had asked, Louis Parati had asked Radice, well, we want to get a copy of this transcript, this other thing you did, this other interview you did that we didn't get to see. And he says, oh, no, you don't need that. You don't need to see that. Because, Mr. Parati was a sharp guy, still is, and he would have seen that initialing of her date of birth and understood that it was fraud. So the cover-up happened at the level of Radice, Paul Sullivan, and ultimately Frank Walsh, who took over as chief. Now, why? I thought maybe Paul Sullivan, he did fall on his sword for Doris Duke, because at the wrongful death trial, he said no foul play. He went along with this absurd story that it was an accident. Paul Sullivan, a great man, he could have been a congressman one day. He was very socially active, however, this is interesting. The last job he had, he was the heir apparent to be chief. The last job he had was as night watch commander on the patrol unit, which is like being in Siberia if you're a cop, okay? And I was told by a relative off the record recently that he was just so disgusted with the whole thing that he just kind of withdrew, in the last years of his life. Professional life were sad.
Peter, before we give the entire book away, I have one last question. What has been the reception from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, reception from Newport Restoration Foundation?
No reaction from the Charitable Foundation, but and I refer people to go on my website, peterlance.com, because they have, what's very interesting, I have a chapter 34 in the book called The Cover-Up Continues. And let me describe 3 aspects of the cover-up, if you will. Cover-up is a word that's constantly misused, but in my opinion, this fits the bill. One of the things they did was they found out that I was doing a piece for Vanity Fair. Like the piece was supposed to run in 2019. It got delayed a year, and it's good that it did because it was published in full. And so what they did is what I would call, they did a William Barr, what William Barr did to the Mueller report. They tried to get ahead of my findings. And they had never mentioned Eduardo Torella in the entire 20 years of that Rough Point was a museum. The 20th anniversary was 2020. Okay, never mentioned it. So in April of 2013, they have an exhibit space at the end of the tour. For those of you who have taken it, it's a great tour. I recommend it highly. In fact, I have a map, and I want to talk to you before we go off the air about the map I have in the beginning of the book that has 70 locations for people that don't know Newport. And the first location is Rough Point. And I recommend that people, when they read the book, go take the tour of Rough Point the next day. And I'd be willing to bet that there's been an increase. We sold 5,000 copies in Newport County alone. But anyway, so this exhibit space at the end of the tour on the second floor, they would rotate. There were 2 rooms. So one year it would be Doris's jewelry or Doris's clothing. The year I went in 2018, they had the 50th anniversary of the Restoration Foundation. But since April of 2019, they've had a wall-sized exhibit, and you can see it on my website. Click on it. It says the accident at Rough Point, and it had 5 material misstatements of fact. They left it up all of 2020, and it's still up now, but only recently, after I began challenging them through Mark Thompson, the executive director, Eduardo's niece, Donna Lohmeyer, wrote a very impassioned but legally well-structured letter saying, you know, this thing about settling with my family holds us in a false light, and that's a civil tort. Eduardo can't be liable because he's dead, nor can Doris, but that family had a potential civil tort. They still do. And so they made 2 minor changes. They changed the accident at Rough Point at the top to the incident at Rough Point, and then they cut out that offending last paragraph that said that she settled with the family. But otherwise, it's still up there, and it has several other material misstatements of fact. So my point is, and what I would say, Mr. Thompson, I asked him on my website, would you meet with me? Could we debate this? It would be a great public. I think that a lot of people would show up. You'd have to get the biggest room at Gurney's Hotel to accommodate. I would ask him, why not just take a roller and cover it up? In other words, they say he released a press release to Sean Flynn of the Daily News, has covered this multiple times, as has the Journal, because the Journal even covered it again 2 weeks ago on page 1. And WJR has done a 4-part series. The R.J. Heim just did a follow-up. He basically says in a statement, the death of Eduardo Torella was a tragedy. Okay? He's admitted that. And I think everyone can agree. Well, if it was, why continue to perpetuate this notion that it was just an accident? And you know, or that Doris, one of the things they still say, she was unfamiliar with the transmission of the automobile. So they're still trying to create this frame in which she is innocent. And remember that transcript I told you about, the 3-page transcript, the phony transcript? On the 3rd page, she said, they asked her, were you familiar with the car? Oh, yes. I had driven it 2 times earlier in the day, just prior to, you know, it's like, in other words, every step, my feeling is in this age that we're in of transparency and just be honest, let's admit fault and move on. And what's wrong with, like, as we know, for 150 years, Thomas Jefferson, the greatest historians in America, defended him and said he never fathered slaves until, you know, 1997, it was proven he had 6 children by Sally Hemings. We don't think any less of Thomas Jefferson because of that. He's still the father of our country. If they just came clean about what happened with Doris, I think they'd triple their visitorship, frankly. It's just about the truth. Anyway,
So,
that's
I know you've got a lot more you can talk about this. I want you to touch on a little bit about what you're doing this summer at the Brenton Hotel.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So kindly, the Brenton, Andy Ross, the managing director of the Brenton, which if you have not been there, Newporters, you've got to go. I mean, it's beautiful, 57 rooms right at 31 America's Cup Avenue next to the Marriott, overlooking the Inner Harbor. fabulous. So the second floor, the entire second floor is called the living room. And it's set up, it's a bar, lounge, etc. They serve food. And it's set up to have the feel of a home, because the idea that Andy was going for is that they want people to actually have a unique hotel experience and not just think they're staying in some antiseptic place. So many hotels now are having what they call artist in residence programs with fine artists, and increasingly some are doing author in residence programs. So I sent out a query to like the top 12 hotels in town, I don't know, in May, and Andy, like within minutes, he responded. He's really sharp. He had been at the Vanderbilt for several years. And so we have a situation where they have purchased hardcover first editions to put in their top suites, which go for several thousand a night. And then their lower tier rooms are still $600 or $700 a night, depending on the season. And they're putting the trade paperback there. I signed the copies. And then at least once a week, I'm going to come in. I did one last night, but they hadn't put the books in the room yet, so it was sparsely attended. But each Wednesday for the rest of July, I'm going to come and discuss the book and take people through the investigation, do a sort of hopefully a shorter version of what I've done today for you guys, and with illustrations, etc., and answer any questions, and then sign the book. So if it's Dr. and Mary Jones of Wichita, Kansas, I'll personalize the book for them. And also, we're talking about, Andy and I have been discussing actually me doing tours with this, starting with this map, because people should know that this is not just a story about Doris Duke and Eduardo. It's a real celebration of Newport, Rhode Island. Me growing up there, told through my eyes, but most of the time when I talk about the Avenue crowd, it's very positive and uplifting. It's not negative. And I worked at the reading room as third boy. I love Newport, and the book reflects that. So I might actually do little tours through the hotel of that. So I just would encourage everyone, every Newporter, by the way, that already bought the book, Andy wants to welcome you to come to the hotel on one of these nights, and we'll let people know when I'll be there. So I could sign your copy of the book as well. And if you want to get additional copies, you can buy them through the hotel. And I'm going to do that for the next month. And it's going to be what they call an amenity, a kind of part of what they call the Brenton experience.
Ryan, you still with us?
I am. I'm here.
There he is. I thought I might have cut you off before. Did you?
No, that's all. I was just saying that we should wrap up before we give too much away.
Yeah, well, that's I wanted to get the Brenton Hotel in.
Thank you.
And Peter, unless you have anything more, I think we certainly have whet everybody's appetite. And so there's a lot more in the book, a lot more on Peter's website. And if you have a chance, you can go over and meet Peter, get a copy signed at the Brenton Hotel. And I'm sure that we'll be getting information on when these events will actually happen.
Absolutely. Can't thank you enough.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it.
Peter.
All right, Mr. President, that was a great discussion. And peterlance.com, of course, you can find out a lot more about the book, as well as all that Peter is up to. And again, this author series is brought to you by Charter Books. Now open at 8 Broadway, right there next to Empire on Broadway, Fastnet Pub, right there, locally owned by Steve and his wife. You can stop by the store today or shop them online at anytime at charterbookstore.com. Mr. Prosnitz, thanks for organizing this.
Well, thank you. And we will we'll come up with a few more authors and hopefully some interesting discussions like this. Peter certainly was full of information. I memorized it all.
All right, excellent. And he is laughing in the background. All right, Mr. Prosnitz, till next time. All right, and on behalf of Frank Prosnitz and myself, as well as all of us here at What's Up Newp, I want to thank Mr. Peter Lance for joining us today. peterlance.com. Check back with us later on today at 7 p.m. We'll be joined by Chuck Wentworth, and we'll be talking about the Rhythm and Roots Festival. Ken Abrams will be my co-host at that hour, 7 p.m. today on whatsupnewp.com, as well as on our YouTube channel, Facebook channel, and everywhere else you can find our content. Thanks for watching.